2. Since the Omniscient looks into all hearts, and Yahweh's eyes run to and fro through the whole earth, it were better for the interlocutor of the 89th Psalm not to wax too conscious of his slight moral superiority over the more unconscious God. Better to keep it dark, for Yahweh is no friend of critical thoughts, which in any way diminish the tribute of recognition he demands. Loudly as his power resounds through the universe, the basis of its existence is correspondingly slender, for it needs conscious reflection in order to exist in reality. Existence is only real when it is conscious to somebody. That is why the Creator needs conscious man, even though, from sheer unconsciousness, he would like to prevent him from becoming conscious. And that is also why Yahweh needs the acclamation of a small group of people. One can imagine what would happen if this assembly suddenly decided to stop the applause. There would be a state of high excitation, with outbursts of blind, destructive rage, then a withdrawal into hellish loneliness and the torture of non-existence, followed by a gradual reawakening of an unutterable longing for something which would make him conscious of himself. It is probably for this reason that all pristine things, even man before he becomes the canaille, have a touching, magical beauty. For in its nascent state, each thing after its kind is the most precious, the most desirable, the tenderest thing in the world, being a reflection of the infinite love and goodness of the Creator. In view of the undoubted frightfulness of divine wrath, and in an age when men still knew what they were talking about when they said, "Fear God," it was only to be expected that man's slight superiority should have remained unconscious. The powerful personality of Yahweh, who, in addition to everything else, lacked all biographical antecedents, his original relationship to the Elohim had long since been sunk in oblivion, had raised him above all the noumena of the Gentiles, and had immunized him against the influence that for several centuries had been undermining the authority of the pagan gods. It was precisely the details of their mythological biography that had become their nemesis, for with his growing capacity for judgment, man had found these stories more and more incomprehensible and indecent. Yahweh, however, had no origin and no past, except his creation of the world, with which all history began, and his relation to that part of mankind whose forefather Adam he had fashioned in his own image as the anthropos, the original man, by what appears to have been a special act of creation. One can only suppose that the other human beings who must also have existed at that time had been formed previously on the divine potter's wheel, along with the various kinds of beasts and cattle, those human beings, namely, from whom Cain and Seth chose their wives. If one does not approve of this conjecture, then the only other possibility that remains is the far more scandalous one that they incestuously married their sisters, for whom there is no evidence in the text, as was still surmised by the philosopher Karl Lamprecht at the end of the 19th century. The special providence which singled out the Jews from among the divinely stamped portion of humanity and made them the chosen people had burdened them from the start with a heavy obligation. As usually happens with such mortgages, they quite understandably tried to circumvent it as much as possible. Since the chosen people used every opportunity to break away from him, and Yahweh felt it of vital importance to tie this indispensable object, which he had made godlike for this very purpose, definitely to himself, he proposed to the patriarch Noah a contract between himself on the one hand, and Noah, his children, and all their animals, both tame and wild, on the other, a contract that promised advantages to both parties. In order to strengthen this contract and keep it fresh in the memory, he instituted the rainbow as a token of the covenant. If in future he summoned the thunderclouds which hide within them floods of water and lightning, then the rainbow would appear. reminding him and his people of the contract. The temptation to use such an accumulation of clouds for an experimental deluge was no small one, and it was therefore a good idea to associate it with a sign that would give timely warning of possible catastrophe. In spite of these precautions, the contract had gone to pieces with David, an event which left behind it a literary deposit in the scriptures, and which grieved some few of the devout, who upon reading it became reflective. As the Psalms were zealously read, it was inevitable that certain thoughtful people were unable to stomach the 89th Psalm. However that may be, the fatal impression made by the breach of contract survived. It is historically possible that these considerations influenced the author of the book of Job. The book of Job places this pious and faithful man, so heavily afflicted by the Lord, on a brightly lit stage where he presents his case to the eyes and ears of the world. It is amazing to see how easily Yahweh, quite without reason, had let himself be influenced by one of his sons, by a doubting thought, and made unsure of Job's faithfulness. With his touchiness and suspiciousness, the mere possibility of doubt was enough to infuriate him and induce that peculiar double-faced behavior of which he had already given proof in the Garden of Eden, when he pointed out the tree to the first parents and at the same time forbade them to eat of it. In this way he precipitated the fall which he apparently never intended. Similarly, his faithful servant Job is now to be exposed to a rigorous moral test, quite gratuitously and to no purpose, although Yahweh is convinced of Job's faithfulness and constancy, and could moreover have assured himself beyond all doubt on this point had he taken counsel with his own omniscience. Why then is the experiment made at all, and a bet with the unscrupulous slanderer settled without a stake on the back of a powerless creature? It is indeed no edifying spectacle to see how quickly Yahweh abandons his faithful servant to the evil spirit and lets him fall without compunction or pity into the abyss of physical and moral suffering. From the human point of view, Yahweh's behavior is so revolting that one has to ask oneself whether there is not a deeper motive hidden behind it. Has Yahweh some secret resistance against Job? That would explain his yielding to Satan. But what does man possess that God does not have? Because of his littleness, puniness, and defenselessness against the Almighty, he possesses, as we have already suggested, a somewhat keener consciousness based on self-reflection. He must, in order to survive, always be mindful of his impotence. God has no need of this circumspection, for nowhere does he come up against an insuperable obstacle that would force him to hesitate and hence make him reflect on himself. Could a suspicion have grown up in God that man possesses an infinitely small yet more concentrated light than he, Yahweh, possesses? A jealousy of that kind might perhaps explain his behavior. It would be quite explicable if some such dim, barely understood deviation from the definition of a mere creature had aroused his divine suspicions. Too often already these human beings had not behaved in the prescribed manner. Even his trusty servant Job might have something up his sleeve. Hence Yahweh's surprising readiness to listen to Satan's insinuations against his better judgment. Without further ado, Job is robbed of his herds, his servants are slaughtered, his sons and daughters are killed by a whirlwind, and he himself is smitten with sickness and brought to the brink of the grave. To rob him of peace altogether, his wife and his old friends are let loose against him, all of whom say the wrong things. His justified complaint finds no hearing with the judge who is so much praised for his justice. Job's right is refused in order that Satan be not disturbed in his play. One must bear in mind here the dark deeds that follow one another in quick succession: robbery, murder, bodily injury with premeditation, and denial of a fair trial. This is further exacerbated by the fact that Yahweh displays no compunction, remorse, or compassion, but only ruthlessness and brutality. The plea of unconsciousness is invalid, seeing that he flagrantly violates at least 3 of the commandments he himself gave out on Mount Sinai. Job's friends do everything in their power to contribute to his moral torments, and instead of giving him, whom God has perfidiously abandoned, their warm-hearted support, they moralize in an all-too-human manner, that is, in the stupidest fashion imaginable, and fill him with wrinkles. They thus deny him even the last comfort of sympathetic participation and human understanding, so that one cannot altogether suppress the suspicion of connivance in high places. Why Job's torments and the divine wager should suddenly come to an end is not quite clear. So long as Job does not actually die, the pointless suffering could be continued indefinitely. We must, however, keep an eye on the background of all these events. It is just possible that something in this background will gradually begin to take shape as a compensation for Job's undeserved suffering, something to which Yahweh, even if he had only a faint inkling of it, could hardly remain indifferent. Without Yahweh's knowledge and contrary to his intentions, the tormented though guiltless Job had secretly been lifted up to a superior knowledge of God, which God himself did not possess. Had Yahweh consulted his omniscience, Job would not have had the advantage of him. But then, so many other things would not have happened either. Job realizes God's inner antinomy, and in the light of this realization, his knowledge attains a divine numinosity. The possibility of this development lies, one must suppose, in man's godlikeness, which one should certainly not look for in human morphology. Yahweh himself had guarded against this error by expressly forbidding the making of images. Job, by his insistence on bringing his case before God, even without hope of a hearing, had stood his ground and thus created the very obstacle that forced God to reveal his true nature. With this dramatic climax, Yahweh abruptly breaks off his cruel game of cat and mouse. But if anyone should expect that his wrath will now be turned against the slanderer, he will be severely disappointed. Yahweh does not think of bringing this mischief-making son of his to account, nor does it ever occur to him to give Job at least the moral satisfaction of explaining his behavior. Instead, he comes riding along on the tempest of his almightiness and thunders reproaches at the half-crushed human worm. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without insight? In view of the subsequent words of Yahweh, one must really ask oneself, who is darkening what counsel? The only dark thing here is how Yahweh ever came to make a bet with Satan. It is certainly not Job who has darkened anything, and least of all a counsel, for there was never any talk of this, nor will there be in what follows. The bet does not contain any counsel so far as one can see, unless, of course, it was Yahweh himself who egged Satan on for the ultimate purpose of exalting Job. Naturally, this development was foreseen in omniscience, and it may be that the word counsel refers to this eternal and absolute knowledge. If so, Yahweh's attitude seems the more illogical and incomprehensible, as he could then have enlightened Job on this point, which, in view of the wrong done to him, would have been only fair and equitable. I must therefore regard this possibility as improbable, whose words are without insight. Presumably Yahweh is not referring to the words of Job's friends, but is rebuking Job. But what is Job's guilt? The only thing he can be blamed for is his incurable optimism in believing that he can appeal to divine justice. In this he is mistaken. As Yahweh's subsequent words prove, God does not want to be just. He merely flaunts might over right. Job could not get that into his head because he looked upon God as a moral being. He had never doubted God's might, but had hoped for right as well. He had, however, already taken back this error when he recognized God's contradictory nature, and by so doing, he assigned a place to God's justice and goodness. So one can hardly speak of lack of insight. The answer to Yahweh's conundrum is therefore, it is Yahweh himself who darkens his own counsel and who has no insight. He turns the tables on Job and blames him for what he himself does. Man is not permitted to have an opinion about him, and in particular is to have no insight, which he himself does not possess. For 71 verses, he proclaims his world-creating power to his miserable victim, who sits in ashes and scratches his sores with potsherds, and who by now has had more than enough of superhuman violence. Job has absolutely no need of being impressed by further exhibitions of this power. Yahweh, in his omniscience, could have known just how incongruous his attempts at intimidation were in such a situation. He could easily have seen that Job believes in his omnipotence as much as ever, and has never doubted it or wavered in his loyalty. Altogether, he pays so little attention to Job's real situation that one suspects him of having an ulterior motive which is more important to him. Job is no more than the outward occasion for an inward process of dialectic in God. His thunderings at Job so completely miss the point that one cannot help but see how much he is occupied with himself. The tremendous emphasis he lays on his omnipotence and greatness makes no sense in relation to Job, who certainly needs no more convincing, but only becomes intelligible when aimed at a listener who doubts it. This doubting thought is Satan, who after completing his evil handiwork has returned to the paternal bosom in order to continue his subversive activity there. Yahweh must have seen that Job's loyalty was unshakable and that Satan had lost his bet. He must also have realized that in accepting this bet, he had done everything possible to drive his faithful servant to disloyalty, even to the extent of perpetrating a whole series of crimes. Yet it is not remorse, and certainly not moral horror, that rises to his consciousness, but an obscure intimation of something that questions his omnipotence. He is particularly sensitive on this point because might is the great argument. But omniscience knows that might excuses nothing. The said intimation refers, of course, to the extremely uncomfortable fact that Yahweh had let himself be bamboozled by Satan. This weakness of his does not reach full consciousness, since Satan is treated with remarkable tolerance and consideration. Evidently, Satan's intrigue is deliberately overlooked at Job's expense. Luckily enough, Job had noticed during this harangue that everything else had been mentioned except his right. He has understood that it is at present impossible to argue the question of right, as it is only too obvious that Yahweh has no interest whatever in Job's cause, but is far more preoccupied with his own affairs. Satan, that is to say, has somehow to disappear, and this can best be done by casting suspicion on Job as a man of subversive opinions. The problem is thus switched on to another track, and the episode with Satan remains unmentioned and unconscious. To the spectator, it is not quite clear why Job is treated to this almighty exhibition of thunder and lightning, but the performance as such is sufficiently magnificent and impressive to convince not only a larger audience, but above all Yahweh himself of his unassailable power. Whether Job realizes what violence Yahweh is doing to his own omniscience by behaving like this, we do not know, but his silence and submission leave a number of possibilities open. Job has no alternative but formally to revoke his demand for justice, and he therefore answers in the words quoted at the beginning, "I lay my hand on my mouth." He betrays not the slightest trace of mental reservation. In fact, his answer leaves us in no doubt that he has succumbed completely and without question to the tremendous force of the divine demonstration. The most exacting tyrant should have been satisfied with this, and could be quite sure that his servant, from terror alone, to say nothing of his undoubted loyalty, would not dare to nourish a single improper thought for a very long time to come. Strangely enough, Yahweh does not notice anything of the kind. He does not see Job and his situation at all. It is rather as if he had another powerful opponent in the place of Job, one who was better worth challenging. This is clear from his twice repeated taunt, "Gird up your loins like a man, I will question you, and you shall declare to me." One would have to choose positively grotesque examples to illustrate the disproportion between the two antagonists. Yahweh sees something in Job which we would not ascribe to him but to God. That is an equal power which causes him to bring out his whole power apparatus and parade it before his opponent. Yahweh projects onto Job a skeptic's face, which is hateful to him because it is his own, and which gazes at him with an uncanny and critical eye. He is afraid of it, for only in face of something frightening does one let off a cannonade of references to one's power, cleverness, courage, invincibility, etc. What has all that to do with Job? Is it worth the lion's while to terrify a mouse? Yahweh cannot rest satisfied with the first victorious round. Job has long since been knocked out, but the great antagonist whose phantom is projected onto the pitiable sufferer still stands menacingly upright. Therefore Yahweh raises his arm again. "Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be justified? Have you an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like his? Man, abandoned without protection and stripped of his rights, and whose nothingness is thrown in his face at every opportunity, evidently appears to be so dangerous to Yahweh that he must be battered down with the heaviest artillery. What irritates Yahweh can be seen from his challenge to the ostensible Job. Look on everyone that is proud, and bring him low, and tread down the wicked where they stand. Hide them in the dust together, bind their faces in the hidden place. Then will I also acknowledge to you that your own right hand can give you victory." Job is challenged as though he himself were a god. But in the contemporary metaphysics, there was no deuteros theos, no other god except Satan, who owns Yahweh's ear and is able to influence him. He is the only one who can pull the wool over his eyes, beguile him, and put him up to a massive violation of his own penal code. A formidable opponent indeed, and, because of his close kinship, so compromising that he must be concealed with the utmost discretion, even to the point of God's hiding him from his own consciousness in his own bosom. In his stead, God must set up his miserable servant as the bugbear whom he has to fight, in the hope that by banishing the dreaded countenance to the hidden place, he will be able to maintain himself in a state of unconsciousness. The stage managing of this imaginary duel, the speechifying, and the impressive performance given by the prehistoric menagerie would not be sufficiently explained if we tried to reduce them to the purely negative factor of Yahweh's fear of becoming conscious and of the relativization which this entails. The conflict becomes acute for Yahweh as a result of a new factor, which is, however, not hidden from omniscience, though in this case the existing knowledge is not accompanied by any conclusion. The new factor is something that has never occurred before in the history of the world, the unheard of fact that, without knowing it or wanting it, a mortal man is raised by his moral behavior above the stars in heaven, from which position of advantage he can behold the back of Yahweh, the abysmal world of shards. Does Job know what he has seen? If he does, he is astute or canny enough not to betray it. But his words speak volumes. "I know that thou canst do all things, and that no purpose of thine can be thwarted." Truly, Yahweh can do all things, and permits himself all things without batting an eyelid. With brazen countenance, he can project his shadow side and remain unconscious at man's expense. He can boast of his superior power and enact laws which mean less than air to him. Murder and manslaughter are mere bagatelles, and if the mood takes him, he can play the feudal grand seigneur and generously recompense his bondslave for the havoc wrought in his wheat fields. So you have lost your sons and daughters? No harm done. I will give you new and better ones. Job continues, no doubt with downcast eyes and in a low voice. Who is this that hides counsel without insight? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you declare to me. I had heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees thee. Therefore I abhor myself, and repent in dust and ashes. Shrewdly, Job takes up Yahweh's aggressive words and prostrates himself at his feet, as if he were indeed the defeated antagonist. Guileless as Job's speech sounds, it could just as well be equivocal. He has learned his lesson well and experienced wonderful things, which are none too easily grasped. Before he had known Yahweh by the hearing of the ear, but now he has got a taste of his reality, more so even than David, an incisive lesson that had better not be forgotten. Formerly he was naive, dreaming perhaps of a good God or of a benevolent ruler and just judge. He had imagined that a covenant was a legal matter, and that anyone who was party to a contract could insist on his rights as agreed, that God would be faithful and true, or at least just, and as one could assume from the Ten Commandments, would have some recognition of ethical values, or at least feel committed to his own legal standpoint. But, to his horror, he has discovered that Yahweh is not human, but in certain respects less than human, that he is just what Yahweh himself says of Leviathan, the crocodile. He beholds everything that is high. He is king over all proud beasts. Unconsciousness has an animal nature. Like all old gods, Yahweh has his animal symbolism, with its unmistakable borrowings from the much older theriomorphic gods of Egypt, especially Horus and his 4 sons. Of the 4 animals of Yahweh, only one has a human face. That is probably Satan, the godfather of man as a spiritual being. Ezekiel's vision attributes 3/4 animal nature and only 1/4 human nature to the animal deity, while the upper deity, the one above the sapphire throne, merely had the likeness of a man. This symbolism explains Yahweh's behavior, which, from the human point of view, is so intolerable. It is the behavior of an unconscious being who cannot be judged morally. Yahweh is a phenomenon, and, as Job says, not a man. One could, without too much difficulty, impute such a meaning to Job's speech. Be that as it may, Yahweh calmed down at last. The therapeutic measure of unresisting acceptance had proved its value yet again. Nevertheless, Yahweh is still somewhat nervous of Job's friends. They have not spoken of me what is right. The projection of his doubt complex extends, comically enough one must say, to these respectable and slightly pedantic old gentlemen, as though God knows what depended on what they thought. But the fact that men should think at all, and especially about him, is maddeningly disquieting, and ought somehow to be stopped. It is far too much like the sort of thing his vagrant son is always springing on him, thus hitting him in his weakest spot. How often already has he bitterly regretted his unconsidered outbursts? One can hardly avoid the impression that omniscience is gradually drawing near to a realization, and is threatened with an insight that seems to be hedged about with fears of self-destruction. Fortunately, Job's final declaration is so formulated that one can assume with some certainty that, for the protagonists, the incident is closed for good and all. We, the commenting chorus on this great tragedy, which has never at any time lost its vitality, do not feel quite like that. For our modern sensibilities, it is by no means apparent that with Job's profound obeisance to the majesty of the divine presence, and his prudent silence, a real answer has been given to the question raised by the satanic prank of a wager with God. Job has not so much answered as reacted in an adjusted way. In so doing, he displayed remarkable self-discipline, but an unequivocal answer has still to be given. To take the most obvious thing, what about the moral wrong Job has suffered? Is man so worthless in God's eyes that not even a tort moral can be inflicted on him? That contradicts the fact that man is desired by Yahweh, and that it obviously matters to him whether men speak right of him or not. He needs Job's loyalty, and it means so much to him that he shrinks at nothing in carrying out his test. This attitude attaches an almost divine importance to man, for what else is there in the whole wide world that could mean anything to one who has everything? Yahweh's divided attitude, which on the one hand tramples on human life and happiness without regard, and on the other hand must have man for a partner, puts the latter in an impossible position. At one moment, Yahweh behaves as irrationally as a cataclysm. The next moment, he wants to be loved, honored, worshipped, and praised as just. He reacts irritably to every word that has the faintest suggestion of criticism, while he himself does not care a straw for his own moral code if his actions happen to run counter to its statutes. One can submit to such a God only with fear and trembling, and can try indirectly to propitiate the despot with unctuous praises and ostentatious obedience. But a relationship of trust seems completely out of the question to our modern way of thinking. Nor can moral satisfaction be expected from an unconscious nature God of this kind. Nevertheless, Job got his satisfaction without Yahweh's intending it, and possibly without himself knowing it, as the poet would have it appear. Yahweh's allocutions have the unthinking, yet nonetheless transparent purpose of showing Job the brutal power of the demiurge. This is I, the creator of all the ungovernable, ruthless forces of nature, which are not subject to any ethical laws. I too am an amoral force of nature, a purely phenomenal personality that cannot see its own back. This is, or at any rate could be, a moral satisfaction of the first order for Job, because through this declaration man, in spite of his impotence, is set up as a judge over God himself. We do not know whether Job realizes this, but we do know from the numerous commentaries on Job that all succeeding ages have overlooked the fact that a kind of Moira or dike rules over Yahweh, causing him to give himself away so blatantly. Anyone can see how he unwittingly raises Job by humiliating him in the dust. By so doing, he pronounces judgment on himself and gives man the moral satisfaction whose absence we found so painful in the book of Job. The poet of this drama showed a masterly discretion in ringing down the curtain at the very moment when his hero gave unqualified recognition to the apophysis megali of the demiurge by prostrating himself at the feet of his divine majesty. No other impression was permitted to remain. An unusual scandal was blowing up in the realm of metaphysics, with supposedly devastating consequences, and nobody was ready with a saving formula which would rescue the monotheistic conception of God from disaster. Even in those days, the critical intellect of a Greek could easily have seized on this new addition to Yahweh's biography and used it in his disfavor, as indeed happened, though very much later, so as to mete out to him the fate that had already overtaken the Greek gods. But a relativization of God was utterly unthinkable at that time and remained so for the next 2,000 years. The unconscious mind of man sees correctly even when conscious reason is blind and impotent. The drama has been consummated for all eternity. Yahweh's dual nature has been revealed, and somebody or something has seen and registered this fact. Such a revelation, whether it reached man's consciousness or not, could not fail to have far-reaching consequences.